You asked and Imperial listened. Due to extreme popularity and brewer demand, the A44 Kveik blend is being released as a year-round available strain. This blend of 3 proprietary Kveik strains absolutely loves hot fermentations, producing beers bursting with fruity notes of pineapple, guava, and tropical flavors. Use it for your summer blonde ales, your hazy IPA, or anything else you want to have a delectable fruity fermentation character. And A44 is absolutely perfect for those who may not have the ability to precisely control fermentation temperatures. Just pitch your pouch and let her rip. Pick up your homebrew pouch wherever Imperial Yeast is sold and place commercial orders at imperialyeast.com. Back in the earlier days of homebrewing, it was standard practice for brewers to transfer their beer from the primary fermentation vessel to a secondary fermenter after about a week of fermentation, the purpose being to reduce the risk of off-flavors caused by autolysis, which is yeast cell death. The beer would then sit in secondary for another 2-ish weeks before being packaged. Well, over the last decade or so, this approach has largely fallen to the wayside, with many brewers opting to ferment entirely in the primary vessel. And while for some this led to quicker turnaround times, others let their beer sit on the trub for extended periods before being packaged. Does this impact beer character? You're listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me to discuss the impact extended time in primary has on beer is contributor Jake Huolihan.
So this, of all the topics that we kind of talk about, is one of the ones that I think I've seen the most flip-flop on in my time as a home brewer. It seems like when I first started, everybody, like you said, was all about getting it off that yeast cake super fast, getting it into that secondary fermenter. But then, after that, it kind of became different, and now here we are today. So
yeah, it's an interesting one. I've been in this thing a bit longer than you, brewing beer and such. And it was back in the day. There was I didn't know anybody who didn't rack to a secondary. I've talked with quite a few new brewers over the years, and it's been interesting to observe this shift in thinking when it comes to the whole secondary thing. Like I said, when I started it, I would never have thought not to transfer to secondary. Then around like 2010, 2011, people began talking about how racking to a secondary increases the risk of oxidation and how big of a deal that is, as well as how modern yeast is healthy enough that autolysis isn't that big of an issue. Of course, as people began skipping secondary, they began questioning just how long a beer could sit on the yeast in primary before problems would arise. That's exactly what we're going to be talking about in this episode. And we'll also be getting into the results of a fascinating experiment that you performed on the subject, Jake. All right, if you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. By making a small monthly pledge, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Coming up later this month is going to be an awesome one. Wayfinder Beers' Kevin Davey will be spending an hour taking questions from patrons. I am super excited for this. Jake, I know you love Wayfinder, and you visit Portland more than I do, so you've had ample opportunity to drink their amazing lagers.
Oh, yeah. This is one of those ones. I mean, we've had a few over the years where it's just like something that hits either a variable or a beer style that I just love, and Wayfinder makes some of the best lagers I've ever had. So I'm really excited to listen to this one.
Yeah, me too, man. Like I said in a previous episode, Wayfinder's up in the top 3 of my favorite American breweries. So I think this is going to be a good one, especially if you like lagers. And Kevin's just a great guy. So if you want in on that session, you're going to have to make sure to make your pledge at patreon.com/Brewlosophy by April 24th of 2020. Past guests have included folks like Mitch Steele, Mary Izette, and John Palmer, and all past sessions are available on our private Facebook page, so you can watch them whenever you like. Another really easy way to support us is by using the links found at brewlosophy.com/support when you're doing your online shopping, which, given the times, is common. So that would really help us out. Your shopping experience doesn't change at all, and we get a little kickback for the referral. Feedback this week is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who specialize in triclover compatible sanitary fittings, conical fermenters, kettles, and brew stands. Brewers Hardware offers a variety of unique items for home and craft brewers, including high-quality stainless fittings at great prices with super fast shipping. Learn more at brewershardware.com, and don't forget to mention Brewlosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. Again, that's Brewers Hardware. Listener Rob Wazardo wrote in with some feedback on episode 132, which was about our experiences with electric brewing. Jake, I know you've got a lot of experience with electric brewing as well. He said, I'm currently a BIAB brewer, so he's brewing a bag, using propane. I love my current setup, but I've been thinking about making the switch to electric in the next 2 or 3 years for a couple of reasons. He says, one, the ease and cost of electricity versus propane, and two, the biggest reason, I have 2 kids under the age of 2. I love having them hang out while I'm brewing, but I constantly have to keep an eye out for anyone getting close to the burner and kettle. I usually set up in the middle of the garage, but I'd love to be able to plug in and set up along the wall and out of the way. Plus, I feel like an electric kettle will be a lot less apt to trip over than a kettle perched on a burner. My biggest question is about chilling. I currently use an immersion chiller that I put in the boil for the last 15 minutes to sanitize. I don't really want to add a pump and plate chiller or CFC. Do any electric brewers use an immersion chiller, and how does that work with the element at the bottom of the kettle? I feel like resting the chiller directly on the element's a bad idea. Any ideas or techniques you guys have developed would be great to hear.
So, I mean, first off, he definitely hit on some of the great benefits of electric. It's funny, I was just brewing with a friend like a week ago, and the entire time we were brewing, he was out there kind of trying to corral his kids and keep them away from knocking over. I think he has one of those tall propane burners or natural gas, but yeah, and it's just like, this is just something that I haven't experienced in years now.
I know, it's amazing.
In terms of chilling, I mean, I think we all use immersion chillers still. They do work. I kind of tilt mine so it's like resting on the bottom, and the hoses kind of work to like keep that, like, I don't know, like that pull away from it resting on the element itself. But it does definitely come in contact with the element, which isn't on at the time.
Yeah.
I've been doing that now for about 3 years and haven't really noticed any issues or any deforming of my element. But I would not want to just like set it straight up on an element. I think they do make some circular elements. I don't know if that's a specific branded element or something that would allow an immersion chiller just to sit right inside of that.
Yeah.
But yeah, with the traditional element, you do maybe have to work around that a little bit with a immersion chiller.
Yeah. You certainly don't want too much pressure on the element, and immersion chillers, when they're full of water, can weigh quite a bit. I'm brewing on the SS Brewtech 1V, which has the halo, that circular element. I haven't seen that in any other electric setup yet, but there is a Jaded Brewing makes an immersion chiller. It's the one that I'm using, called the Scylla. I believe it's SCYLLA. That is designed specifically to fit inside that halo. So there are options out there. That being said, I know a lot of people who have the standard, more stick looking elements, and a little contact with an immersion chiller doesn't seem to be that big of an issue. I've not heard from anybody who's broken an element. They are made of stainless, so they're really tough, and a little bending I don't think is going to hurt anything. You don't want to put too much weight on there, but we have a couple guys. Paul has been using the Xchillerator Max counterflow chiller, and that thing is amazing, and he loves it. He's so he's not having any issues with putting an IC in his on his element, I guess. But yeah, good question though, Rob, and I do hope one day you get to switch over to electric, because as a father with 3 kids who like to run around while I'm brewing, it is so much less stressful not having a big flame kicking around while they're playing in the garage. You got kids too, Jake, so I'm sure you can relate.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
So thanks for the feedback, Rob. If you've got show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. A few months ago, I got an email from this guy named Christopher Murata saying that he was from Brazil but would be in the United States for a visit, and he's going to bring bottles of this Pilsner that he made, and he wanted to ship it to me from wherever it was he was visiting in the U.S. I believe it was Chicago. Unfortunately, too far away for us to meet up, but he shipped me a couple bottles of this Pilsner that he made, and he asked me for some thoughts.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim.
Let's drink these beers.
No smell.
Easy, simple, delicious.
That's good.
ESD. ISDA. There's nothing else that needs to be said.
Very good.
It's a Bud Light, Miller Lite, Coors Light kind of Pilsner.
Takes me back to summertime in Marshall's garage.
Could drink a lot of these. Feels a little bit heavier than maybe a Coors Light, Miller Lite.
Yeah, we'll go with that.
But it's delicious.
That's very good.
You quaffed it.
Yeah.
And it's clean, dude. Clean. Super clean and dry. That's how we
clean.
like them. Clean and dry, my friend. Let's be honest. I mean, people who make all kinds of artsy-fartsy beers are doing a lot more than this. This is just simple. And that's how we like it, Timmy.
Yeah.
That's our style. Simple.
Why mess with it?
You know why? Mama told me when I was young, you should like simple kind of beer. Yeah, that's delicious.
Yep.
That's good. It's probably Miller Lite, or he knows what we like.
It very well could be. It's good though.
That's why we love it, because we understand it. Because it's a simple kind of beer.
Mine's done.
10 jerseys.
Yeah, we'll go with that.
Yeah, that is a good total.
It is a good score, and it's well deserved because that Pilsner was incredibly good. Crystal clear, nice toasty aroma with just that subtle floral hop character, clean as can be. I'm not sure what approach Christopher took in brewing this beer. He didn't give me all that information, but whatever he did, it absolutely worked out. And what about Jersey and Tim saying at first that it tasted like a Coors Light or a Miller Lite, then making the comment that it was a little heavier? Not too shabby for those guys.
I know it's so great just to see them go through this evolution. I'm drinking what it sounds like you guys had right now as we record here, and I just love that beer style. It's so good.
I'll tell you, I hear from people, international folks who not live in the States, who tell me about issues with ingredients that are available to them, and it makes me wonder sometimes, like, just how close are they getting to what we know to be stylistically accurate. This beer was spot on, absolutely delicious. He sent me 2 bottles, and usually I'll open a couple up during our review sessions. I saved it for myself and drank it alone, so that's how good it was. If you'd like to have your beer or any other fermented beverage you feel like sending in reviewed by Jersey and Tim, you can email me, Marshall@brewlosophy.com, and we'll get you all set up. All right, we'll be right back after this break. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Xchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to xchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com. The brew in a bag method has blown up over the last few years, and in that time, it's become very clear that not all bags are created equal. For the best BIAB experience, you have got to go with the Brew Bag. Made from high-quality, food-safe polyester, the Brew Bag is available in both 210 micron for standard brew in a bag, as well as 400 micron, which works beautifully for all-in-one recirculating systems. I've been a Brew Bag user for years and wouldn't brew without it. Head over to brewinabag.com to get the fabric filter that works for you, and use promo code TBP17 at checkout to receive a discount. Again, that's brewinabag.com. Outside of the one experiment I did on racking beer to a secondary, which was a few years ago, every single beer that I've brewed over the last, 11 years or so has been fermented in the primary vessel only before being packaged. Now, typically this means the beer is on the trub for anywhere between maybe 6 to 14 days, depending on the OG of the beer that I'm brewing. So I don't really worry too much about issues related to what could happen with that beer sitting on the trub for too long. However, for the more patient people out there, or those who find value in extended aging, which I know that there are people out there who do, this might be something that they're concerned with.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about the things that are kind of in beer first that could cause an issue. Before we kind of talk about what is the optimal time to have something in a primary fermenter on top of that that yeast trub cake. So, during fermentation, we've got all this yeast in there, all these sugars, some oxygen, things like that. And the yeast go to work converting those sugars into alcohol, CO2, and more yeast. And in that entire process, there are small other things that are produced as well. We'll just call those byproducts. They're tiny in terms of the entire fermentation system that's going on in your fermentation vessel at that time. But while they are tiny, they can produce large amounts of flavor in the finished beer. So that's kind of what we're really concerned about when we talk about leaving a beer in there for a long time. So not all of these compounds that are left over in the beer that aren't alcohol or yeast are necessarily desirable. Think about things like acetaldehyde, diacetyl, things that have like a low taste threshold that we generally don't want in beers, though they're definitely appropriate probably in some beers. So these various intermediary compounds are produced during the fermentation process. Most of these will be absorbed by the yeast after fermentation is complete, but that's kind of the key word there. Fermentation is complete. Yeast are really going to be efficiently focusing on converting those sugars into alcohol in order to create more yeast cells during the bulk of fermentation. And really, it's only after that is kind of largely done that they're going to shift into these enzymatic processes by which they're absorbing these compounds by breaking them down.
You mentioned acetaldehyde and diacetyl. I think those are probably two of the off flavors most associated with pulling beer out of fermentation, out of the fermentation vessel or the primary too soon. And so one of the arguments you hear from people for leaving beer, on the yeast cake is to clean that stuff up. Back in the days of when secondary racking to a secondary was common, there was kind of this rule of thumb, 1 week in primary, 2 weeks in secondary, 3 weeks in your bottle or your keg, whatever it is, just to make sure that you get that developed flavor. A part of the argument that I hear nowadays with people who aren't using a secondary, but who want to keep their beer on the yeast cake for a while is to reduce the chances of those off flavors, as well as that green character, that quote unquote, green, like the beer's too young thing.
Right. Absolutely. And we know from racking beer into a keg or into bottles, it is hazy for a bit. And a lot of that haze is yeast.
Sure.
So there is still yeast that's in suspension, and they are still like completing these processes by like breaking down these compounds and absorbing these flavors, even after we're not seeing active fermentation. So that definitely could be a positive of leaving it sit in there a little bit longer.
Yeah, for sure. And I remember when I first took the risky step of ditching the secondary thing, and I remember being concerned, like this is probably going to screw up, but other people are doing it. I remember the beer would be done fermenting and it'd just be sitting there not doing anything, and this thought in my mind was like, I have to leave it. I mean, it was usually 3 weeks, the primary / secondary process together was 3 weeks. And so I remember just thinking like, I have to leave it on the yeast cake for a while in order for it to be good,
Yeah, it's crazy. Regardless of the yeast type or the style of beer,
it
has to be in there 3 weeks.
Exactly. Well, what exactly, the issues when it comes to the concerns related to extended time in the primary really are, in my mind, related to the beer being in contact with trub, which is yeast and hop debris and proteins, lipids, all of that stuff. What exactly can happen? I mean, where is that concern, or what is that concern really related to?
Right. So like you said, I mean, that trub cake is made up of, probably 3 main sources of organic material. The first being spent yeast, any hops that you might have dry hopped with or carried over from the boil kettle, and then that hot break, cold break, associated with boiling, anything that got over in there. So the 2 biggest issues that I really see in terms of leaving a beer in that primary fermentation vessel for too long would be autolysis, which you kind of touched on a little bit before, being yeast death, and then the breakdown of those cells after they die, and then just being in contact with that hot break, cold break, which is primarily fats and lipids. Things that came together and dropped out of the boil that we don't necessarily want in beer because they can produce, potential off flavors. I mean, they've been shown to reduce esters, but then they can increase fusel alcohols. Just overall, I mean, I know we've done a bunch of experiments about, trub going into the fermenter.
Yeah.
But like overall, the majority of kind of the thought in the literature out there would say that it doesn't necessarily lead to good flavors in beer, but really, I mean, the time it takes for those flavors to be extracted might not, it might be in the hours. It might not be in the days that we're leaving it sit. So autolysis is probably, the biggest concern with leaving a finished beer on yeast.
Yeah.
Because once that yeast does go dormant and you crank that temperature down, or even if you're not doing that, at higher temperatures, it's going to die faster.
Yeah.
These yeast cells are dying, and then it's an enzymatic degradation of the cell. But typically at our scale, where we're using small, kind of shallow bottom fermentation vessels, that's not seen as big of an issue as it would be if you're using like a 7-barrel fermenter,
right?
And it's got a really tight cone at the bottom, and that cone might be a little bit hotter than the rest of the beer. And all that pressure coming from the top,
right,
really kind of might accelerate that yeast death and breakdown of those cell walls.
Yeah, and one of the things that you'll hear as well when it comes to yeast death, is the hospitability of the environment within which that yeast is at. So if that yeast was used to ferment, say, a 1090 triple IPA or something like that, so there's just all this alcohol, had to work really hard, it may be at a higher risk of dying sooner, whereas compared to the cells that were used to ferment a 1048 blonde ale or something like that. So
most definitely there's certainly like yeast toxicity elements in a beer. I mean, it's not a great environment for any living organism to be submerged in for any amount of time, especially if it's going to be a very high alcohol beer where the yeast might have just fermented that to a level where they just stopped working, and now they're pretty much dead at the bottom.
Right. And let's talk about autolysis for a minute, because that is an off flavor. I feel like a lot of people, it gets tossed around a bit, not as much as diacetyl and DMS, but I feel like it's been kind of pushed to the side a little bit because of how healthy and how high of quality yeast is these days. We really don't. It's not a concern for a lot of brewers, I don't think. Back in the days when I got started, the main reason that we were told to rack over from a primary to a secondary was to avoid, autolyzed off flavors. I mean, that was the big thing. Have you, maybe you've had a flavor standard or something like that, had the opportunity to have a beer that has autolysis off flavors in it?
So I think I made a beer once that had, the flavors of dead yeast in it, and it was from a pitch I had tried to build up from a bottle that maybe I didn't step up as much as I probably should have. And pitched it in a beer, and that beer just kind of tasted like a little like smoky phenolic, kind of like burnt-ish, just not great.
It's terrible. And I sort of did something similar. I now tell people, kind of tongue in my cheek, that my reason for brewing this beer, was because I wanted to test autolysis. That wasn't the case at all. I actually just wanted to make a batch, and I screwed up. But I made this Kolsch a while ago, probably 5 or 6 years ago. First time ever doing just straight up brew in a bag. I wanted to give that a shot. I wanted to have a quick brew day, and I had this. I think it was the PJ Fra strain. The Kolsch yeast sitting in my fridge that I had harvested from a starter probably, 4 or 5 months prior to brewing, and it had just been sitting in there. It still looked okay. So in my mind, I'm thinking, you know what? I'm doing this. At the time, my brain was like, I'm doing this real lazy brewing approach, which is all I do nowadays. And I might as well, I'm not going to prop this yeast up in a starter. I'm not going to do anything like that. I'm just going to pitch it straight, let it warm up for an hour or so while I'm brewing and see what happens. Well, I went out to the fermentation chamber the following day, and there was no bubbling, but all I could, no active bubbling in the airlock, but all I could smell was what I would describe as like burnt tires or burnt rubber. It was absolutely awful. And I didn't know at the time that could be that description was linked to yeast autolysis.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the more common descriptors of it, and not good.
Not at all. Oh, it was horrible. Another one that I've heard when it comes to autolysis is like a meaty, almost like a raw steak characteristic, I guess, or like a salty, savory thing. I'm not sure I've picked that up, or when I've tasted those characteristics, I think they've come from something other than autolysis. But I maybe you have some experience with that. That's not something I'm familiar with, but
I think the one that you're the one that I was specifically talking about previously, where I tried to, prop up some dregs from a bottle that I knew to be like an actual primary strain and not a bottling strain.
Yeah.
I think I did get kind of like a meaty flavor. I don't know. It's weird to describe because like you're not typically drinking meat,
but you know the flavor though. I mean, that's
right. Yeah. But, just overall, autolysis is not good. Of all the off flavors that we can get in the brewing realm, that's probably one of the most offensive.
Yeah. And again, I think, I've done a fair share of judging, and that is not an off flavor that I can't say that I've ever actually noted autolysis off flavors in a beer that I've judged before. I just think it's pretty uncommon. But it is something that when you think about leaving beer on a yeast cake for, a long period of time, arguably, quote unquote, unnecessarily, right? You're just leaving it there maybe because you got lazy, which, I'm wont to do at times. It makes sense. You got this alcoholic environment. You got this, for homebrewers, it's only 5 gallons usually, but a fair amount of pressure on that yeast, that by leaving that beer in contact with that trub, you could be putting yourself at risk of imparting that beer with a touch of that, autolysis off flavor. So that makes sense to me on some level. Another argument that I've heard about, this actually, I believe this came from Mary Izette in a chat I was having with her a while ago. I may be off on that, but whoever it was saying that when they leave a beer in primary for longer than 2 weeks, that the beer ends up developing what she described as a yeasty flavor. So when I think of that, I think of like when you add yeast, your baking bread, and that you got that raw dough, but then you can smell the yeast working as it's rising. And I've definitely picked that up in beers. I don't know if it's because the beer was in contact with the yeast for too long or not, but
yeah, I'm not sure. I know that is also one of those, common descriptors that is associated with autolysis. I think to me, we add I don't know what it's like, nutritional yeast. I think that's what it's called. We'll add that to some like dishes that we make to kind of like add a little bit of, I don't know if it's like a meaty flavor. I definitely don't get like a yeasty necessarily out of it, but it definitely adds something. And I wonder if that's kind of a similar characteristic to what some people describe the autolysis flavor as. I know another common thing talked about when you look at studies done on autolysis is that it destroys beer head. So, if you have a beer with like no head retention that basically appears flat, that could be due to autolysis, because that cell death does release some fatty acids that are stored in that yeast, and as we know, that doesn't really work with foam. It just kind of kills it.
Yeah, for sure. And that is, like you said, that when those cells die, they expel their innards basically. And part of that is what those fatty acids. I mean, you think about any lipid, you take butter and let it go rancid, and it's terrible. You don't want that in your beer. Any sort of fatty, substance has a potential for turning rancid like that. And again, that's not anything that I want in my beer. That being said, there is a good chunk of people out there. Little anecdote here. I remember when I kind of honed my fermentation approach, the approach that I continue to use today. And I was talking to some buddies at a homebrew club meeting, and they were talking about how long is your typical turnaround time, the nerdy stuff that homebrewers talk about. And I said, I've been kegging my beers on day 6 or day 7 when they're sub 1050 OG. People were aghast, couldn't believe that I would do that. And a part of it was, well, how do you know fermentation's done? Well, I've got hydrometers, and I'm ramping temperatures and doing everything I need to do. Well, how you're not, the beer doesn't have time to, develop or, to clean up those off flavors. I mean, people are terrified of that. Then again, you got all of these people who kind of moved up through the old days who were, again, 3 weeks minimum almost. I mean, you had to leave that beer in secondary for 2 weeks. God. And so they're kind of sticking with this middle ground of 2 to 3 weeks. And the argument being that there is something good that's happening. It's not all bad. That yeast isn't dying, but it's actually working. You had talked about this a little bit earlier. It's actually working to remetabolize any of those negative characteristics that may, have stayed in that beer had you packaged it too soon.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, it's going to be different too, just like based on yeast strain. Like maybe an English yeast is like done cleaning up everything after 4 days and you're good to rack it. Whereas maybe a lager is 14 days. I don't know that, having a rule of thumb is necessarily beneficial to anyone. I think, I don't know, maybe just going based off how it tastes and experience and kind of using that as your guide.
Well, it's funny because we were talking a little bit about the differences between when it comes to autolysis and between commercial and homebrewing. And, there's this, that you got the pressure in these big, 15 barrel tanks is way higher on the yeast than it is on a 5-gallon batch of homebrew. I developed the fermentation approach that I use today based off of what I was seeing in my friends' professional breweries. They're not allowing the beer to sit around for 3 weeks, but 3 weeks, they're already, that beer's kegged and half of it's gone, you got to turn that beer around fast. And so, my thinking was just, well, if they can do it, why can't we? We have less stress, pretty much all the way around.
Absolutely. And I think, that's kind of one of the negatives that I was going to talk about here in a little bit related to leaving the beer on the trub for too long is just like that turnaround time it takes for the beer itself. Like, why are you leaving something in a fermentation vessel for 3 weeks if you're not going to see any benefits after day 5? It doesn't make much sense. I mean, on our scale, like maybe 7 days because you need it to be the weekend for you to have time to keg it up, or stuff happens, and I probably won't be too concerned about it. But to like purposefully leave something in there for longer than it necessarily has to be, just doesn't make much sense to me.
Yeah, I agree with you. And you look at probably the 3 biggest off flavors, associated with getting beer off the yeast too soon would be, DMS. I'm sorry, not DMS, diacetyl, acetaldehyde, and like we've been talking about, autolysis. If you're pitching huge, healthy amounts of yeast, those are. You don't have to worry about that as much. And we know that really well. That yeast gets in there, it does its job, it re-ups all that other stuff that you don't want sticking around. And that can happen. I mean, again, this is sort of a function of the OG of the wort, but that can happen in 4 to 5 days easy, for standard strength beers.
Absolutely. I think one of the other, bigger cons to leaving the beer on the trub for too long, and this is probably really only something that affects people on the homebrew scale, it's just those vessels not necessarily being, perfectly airtight. When we stop having that positive pressure from the inside, the liquid goes through temperature fluctuations and creates mini vacuums and could suck in some oxygen that you don't really want in there on a still beer.
I hadn't even considered that. The potential for oxidation just because of it sitting, not in a fully closed container. And that's the thing. There are, homebrewing has gotten to a point now, and we've learned so much about this thing where we kind of get to pick and choose what things we want to worry about the most. And oxidation at this point, I feel like is such a big issue when it comes to beer quality overall, that would be more my focus at this point than, leaving the beer around too long. But that, in the past, I have done that. There was one time I made an IPA and I put it in the primary and threw it in my fermentation chamber and literally forgot that I brewed it. Not sure how that can happen when you're drinking and brewing at the same time. Spent 4 weeks in the primary before I ended up adding the dry hop charge, and then I let it sit alone for another week after that. So 5 weeks in total. And as far as I remember, that beer was completely fine. I mean, I thought I was going to, again, we worry about the smallest things, but I honestly thought this beer was going to be terrible. I wasn't going to dump it. I brewed it already. So I added that dry hop at a month in and let it sit for a week. And it came out fine. I made a rye pale ale a few years ago. No dry hops added to this one. And I just kept ignoring it because I was doing other stuff. I was brewing experiments. I was collecting data. So it ended up sitting in primary for over 6 weeks. The beer was super clear even before cold crashing it. I was fermenting this one in a one of those PET carboys, so you could see it. I mean, it was crystal clear even after cold crashing. Came out tasting absolutely delicious. In fact, a few friends and I ended up killing the whole keg over the course of like 3 or 4 days. I mean, so to me, if there were issues in those beers, they weren't being compared to anything. These were just single one-off beers that I brewed to enjoy over here. Whatever may have happened to them wasn't bad enough for me not to like the beers,
Yeah, for sure. I don't know. We've done like judging and stuff, and we've all had these like awful homebrew beers, but it's like when I'm making them at home and when I'm having ones that like I know people that have made, they just, I don't know where all these horror stories and fears are coming from.
Yeah. God. Well, and I'll be honest, for the people who are concerned with, or perhaps maybe have a higher sensitivity to tasting, these certain off flavors that can be developed by packaging, in what they think is too soon of time after pitching the yeast, I completely understand wanting to leave that beer, in primary for a while. But is it having an impact? Is some sort of noticeable thing happening to the beer by sitting on that yeast longer than the typical weekish time frame that I think a lot of people are doing nowadays? That's exactly what you aimed to address, an experiment that you did, Jake. And we're going to be talking about those results when we're back from this break. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com. And be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all-grain beer in a single, compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high-quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to Grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to Grainfather.com, that's Grainfather.com, and get started today.
Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD, that's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. There are a number of reasons one might leave their beer in the primary fermenter for an extended period of time. For me, it's generally laziness, though others might do it based on the belief that it benefits the beer. Jake, you were curious to see for yourself and performed an experiment to test it out.
Yeah, so I was in a really unique situation with this one where I kind of had the opportunity to brew 10 gallons of beer where 5 gallons, was going to be kegged based on something I'd done previously and into the keezer right away. So I decided to leave the other half of that second batch to kind of compare this variable that had been bouncing around my mind for a while, and something I had been interested in probably since I started brewing, and just this being such a big talking point for people. So I brewed up a single 10-gallon batch of Märzen. I believe it was about like 2/3 Vienna malt, a little less than a third Munich 2, and then some Root Shoot Odyssey Pilsner. I mashed both of these. I mashed this beer at 152, which is 67C, for 60 minutes, and then boiled it for 60 minutes, adding some Magnum, the first wort hop, and then a little bit of Pearl around halfway. Not a very highly hopped beer, just basically let the malt talk, and hopefully, any subtle differences, which is ultimately what I thought any differences probably would be in this experiment, let those shine through. So after the boil, I chilled this beer down, and noted an OG of 1055. It was split between two brew buckets evenly, and then I pitched a pouch of Imperial Yeast L17 Harvest into each one.
Love that yeast, by the way.
I know that yeast is fantastic.
Yeah, one of the best.
I fermented them at 50F, which is 10C, for 10 days. Before raising the temperature up to 58 or 14C for a brief diacetyl rest, to kind of force the yeast to speed up and clean up any potential off flavors that might be around by an incomplete fermentation. And then 3 days later, I took hydrometer measurements, showing both were at the same specific gravity of 1013, and I chilled those back down to 50 for a day before being cooled down to 45F or 7C for another 2 days. So once they were at that temperature after 2 days, the first beer was racked into a CO2 purged keg, placed in my keezer, while the other was left on the trub, the yeast, whatever was in that fermentation vessel post-fermentation, to sit for another 3 weeks. So I left it sitting there for 3 weeks, and then racked it into a separate CO2 purge keg and placed it next to the other one in my keezer, at which point they were both carbonated and left to lager for a month or so before being served to tasters.
So you had 3 weeks. I just want to get this clear because I think some people might hear this and think, well, it was only 3 weeks. It was actually in total about 5 weeks, right? Because you did fermentation, the diacetyl rest, all of that before racking the other beer to the keg and then leaving this one alone for an additional 3 weeks. So would you say, well, like 4.5, 5 weeks in total, right?
Yeah, I believe it was about 14 days in primary fermentation. So yeah, 3 weeks on top of that puts it at about 5 weeks.
Perfect.
Before kegging, which is that's way longer than I would really ever do.
Yeah. I mean, unless I forget it or I get lazy or I go on vacation, I brewed last weekend and I'm kegging it after we get done recording today. I mean, it's been a week. It's actually been 6 days as of today. So that's kind of my normal process now. 5 weeks is 4 weeks longer than my typical thing. So to me, this was very interesting. Now, before we get into the tasting results, was there a difference in appearance? You talked about head formation and how autolysis can lead to less foam quality. Was there any differences that you could see with your eyes between these beers?
So first off, I mean, like as one would imagine, when I initially kegged the second batch, it was more hazy than the one that had been in the keezer for those 3 additional weeks. That makes sense, just given time at a colder temperature. Overall, I didn't notice, too many objective differences. The other one did eventually clear, though it never quite got as clear as the beer that had been in the keg for longer. Though I have to assume that, give it 3 more weeks in the keg, it would have probably look the exact same as that one did at the time they were both served.
I'm looking at the pictures right now, and I mean, they look so similar. Yeah, I get what you're saying. There's a slight, to me, it almost looks like, and I trust that the beer was slightly more hazy, but it almost looks like the one that was aged in primary for 3 weeks extra, has condensation on the glass. I mean, it's really not that big of a difference. And like you said, to me, that could just be purely a function of the fact that it was agitated during the kegging process and hadn't been sitting in the cold keezer for as long. So that makes sense. Though it could also have been a function of the variable. Who knows? Maybe there was something about that extended contact time that led to a slight increase in haze.
Right. That's kind of one of the things with experiments like this is we have no way to catch those up and take a picture at where they're both at the exact same point in time.
Yeah. I mean, these time-related experiments, you have to make some concessions, and, we're not in a lab, and we're not doing, we're trying to make this thing as interesting as possible from our garages. So, all right. You ended up doing 5 semi-blind triangle test attempts yourself.
I did. Just first off, like before even doing the testing and stuff, just kind of tasting these side by side, I thought they were definitely more similar than different. I didn't really have strong feelings towards either one either way. But in the semi-blind triangle test, I was right 3 out of 5 times, which, I mean, it's more than half, but I don't think that's significant at 5 at 5 of an N.
Yeah. No, it's not. And you're also, you were the one doing these, having known everything about the variable, about the way these beers were brewed, all that stuff. And still, on top of only getting 3 out of 5 attempts right, you're sitting there going, they were more similar than different. I mean, that to me, there's some, it's kind of meaningful. So
right. Yep. Nothing really stood out to me as being different between these two beers. And I did, sit there and try to focus on them with more time than the average participant would have. And to me, there just wasn't something there I could key in on. Like no yeasty meaty flavor. Nothing to the effect of that would really just allow me to laser focus every single time. Okay, this is the different one.
Well, obviously though, your palate is terrible because you're not sensitive enough to those off flavors, right? I mean, that's
it's definitely possible.
That's definitely possible. But that's why we serve these beers to blind participants who know nothing at all about the beer, how it was brewed, what the variable was, and anything like that. They get their 3 beers, 2 are the same, one's different. We ask them to pick the one that's different. You did that to 22 participants, out of whom 12 would have been required to choose the odd beer out, the unique sample in the triangle test, in order for us to say that this was significant. And
in the end, actually 13 did get this correct. So, that did beat the p-value that we set. So we can reliably say that, participants in this specific experiment were able to tell these beers apart. Then we go and ask some preference data. So 4 people preferred the beer that was packaged immediately after fermentation was done. 2 people preferred the beer that was packaged after spending 3 weeks additional in primary. And then 5 had no preference despite tasting a difference. And 2 reported perceiving no difference. So, really kind of across the board in terms of the preference question there, which we see often. I mean, I think typically we see less no preference ones than that because I think people generally kind of like to key into the one that they think was different as, either being one that they disliked more or one that they liked more. So,
people get pretty confident when they think that they got it right, and I'm clumped myself into that. That's not a diss. And so then we, once we're done doing the triangle test, that subtle confidence, I think, has some sort of an impact on which one I like more and which one I don't, So the preference question is, it's very subjective. People are going to prefer things that others don't like. I get that. But it is surprising to me that 13 out of 22 people, a full 59% of your participants were able to distinguish the odd beer out. There's always a possibility that there's a false positive. But in this one, I wonder, we don't ask the question. It'd be a lot, you will go back and address these things later. We're going to develop a way to retest significant experiments from the past. But what I'll usually do is when I'm done serving the triangle test to tasters, I will talk to people who have finished it and just ask what they thought. I wonder if you did that with any of your participants, and if they explained at all what it was that they perceived as being different between the beers.
I typically do. It's been a while since we did this one, so I don't remember specifically on that one, but I seem to recall it was just like, they weren't that much different, and people that maybe did get it right were kind of, surprised, because I think a lot of the people that, we do serve these to are, kind of veterans of doing the experiments, and they're used to being wrong more than they're being right. So when it does come back like that, and we kind of do talk about the variable, I think it was kind of surprising to some people that they did get it right. But I don't recall anything specifically being said as like, oh, this one tasted like burnt rubber, or this one tasted like a steak I had 30 minutes before coming here.
The Willy Wonka beer. It's. I think back to the bits, little stories I told in the last segment about how the times that I've left beer sitting in the primary for a long time, and it's hard not to look at that the preference and not be influenced by that a little bit, to say, oh, people should take their beer off of the yeast cake sooner because 4 people liked that versus the 2 who liked the old one. Again, I've brewed a few beers and got lazy and left them in primary for a long time, and they were fantastic. I mean, there was no issues with them, but it does make me wonder how they would have tasted had I, pulled them off a little bit sooner, I guess. Yeah,
totally. I don't know. I mean, again, to me, I'm going to be biased based on the test that I did here. And just think like, they really weren't that different. But I don't know. I mean, maybe I would have consumed the one that was pulled earlier quicker if I wasn't doing this experiment, and maybe it would have tasted different than they both tasted at that time.
Sure. And, and thinking of implications, I guess, what this experiment tells us is that keeping beers in primary for up to 5 weeks, it was quote unquote only 5 weeks, but it may have some sort of a perceptible impact on beer quality, and perhaps even longer times would have a stronger impact. It doesn't say that it has a totally negative impact or a totally positive impact, but it is interesting to see that, again, 59% of tasters were able to tell these beers apart. I think that's really interesting. To my mind, I'm not going to worry too much in the future if something comes up and I have to leave a batch in primary for a month or maybe even a little longer. At the same time, I'm still going to keep doing what I do personally because of these results. I like getting beer in the keezer as quickly as possible because I sort of prefer drinking it rather than watching it ferment. So
yeah, I mean, to me, I think the data doesn't like swing strongly enough one way or the other to say like, oh, you have to leave a beer in primary for 5 weeks, or no, you need to be taking it out 2 weeks max. I mean, it just said, maybe they are different, and maybe some people can tell that difference. And you should probably, if you have strong feelings one way or the other, you should probably, try out something similar to this and see if you really do have a preference for the one that stuck around in there longer.
Yeah.
Or if maybe you could turn it around a little bit quicker and get that beer on tap a little faster.
Yeah. And I will say that these beers were both fermented with very healthy yeast. You proper pitch rates, all of that. You can't use these results to speak to those who are fermenting with I guess less high quality, lower quality yeast is a way to put it. If you're pitching an old pouch of dry yeast or something like that, and then you're going to leave it for another 6 weeks, I just don't that seems more risky to me. Perhaps more likely to lead to issues, but
yeah, I think it does. And I mean, obviously there is a point where autolysis will happen.
Oh yeah.
If we leave that in there. So, I mean, it's probably just, more taking your personal experience, your understanding of kind of what the beer is and what you're putting into it, and then past experience to kind of see like, where is that cutoff? When am I going to start to taste these off flavors?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know many homebrewers who, other than like specific big styles of beer, are brewing beer and just going like, oh man, I can't wait to drink this in 6 weeks or whatever. I mean, I think we'd all rather drink it the day of.
Yeah. Well, and that's exactly it. I guess you could use that preference data for something. Hey, 4 people liked it, like the one that was, kegged young, I guess. So that's pretty cool. Well, we do have some reader comments I'd like to get to. The first one comes from JJ Hull. He says, interesting. I bottle my beer, and transferring to secondary not only helps with clarity, but reduces the sediment at the bottom of the bottle. In your picture, does the aged beer glass have condensation, or is the beer cloudier? A couple of things I think we can address there.
Yeah, so I think it was definitely cloudier, but I think that's more of a function of the fact that the one on the left was colder for 3 additional weeks. Just giving that yeast more time to precipitate down to the bottom. As we all know, cold promotes flocculation and settling out. So I really think that that's pretty much the only difference in the haze on the two. In terms of less sediment in the bottles, by doing a secondary versus primary only, I haven't bottled in so long. I don't know, but when I was bottling, I never got tons of sediment on there. I mean, I would just do it in the primary, rack it into a bottling bucket, and bottle it up. And I always got just kind of like that fine dusting at the bottom. Yeah, it was never anything excessive.
That and the clarity thing when it comes to racking to a secondary. I feel like that was the when people started moving to primary only fermentations. Those were the arguments people who didn't want to abandon racking to a secondary would make. It doesn't make physical sense to me that racking to a secondary would allow you to leave more stuff behind because it doesn't. If you start your siphon from your fermentation vessel in the middle of the beer and then very gently lower your siphon so that it doesn't touch the trub on the bottom of your fermentation vessel, you are going to rack the same amount of stuff over to your bottling bucket that you would if you racked it to a secondary first. If you want to leave that beer for 3 weeks in the primary to match the amount of time given to the beer for that stuff to precipitate and settle out, fine. I mean, there's no good reason for those not to be identical in terms of how much particulate is still in suspension. So I don't get the argument. Same thing with the clarity thing. In fact, I was talking about this with somebody a while back, and they were telling me that being in contact with the full yeast cake actually encourages or promotes clarity as opposed to racking over to a secondary where there's way less trub. So I just don't know if that's a good reason to rack to a secondary. Everybody I know, my brother's one of them, who still bottle conditions, they're not using a secondary that I know of, and they're making crystal clear beers. So, those are my thoughts on that one. So, all right. Derek Pruitt says it's very possible the difference in flavor was more due to the temperature difference than the time spent on the yeast cake. He's referring here to the temp difference during storage, I believe. So your Keyser was at 38 degrees Fahrenheit or 3 degrees Celsius versus the beer aged in primary, which during that time was sitting at 45F or 7C.
Yeah, there was a difference between the two beers for 3 weeks. As we know, warmer temperatures, promote various reactions to happen faster. It's definitely possible that the beer that was in the primary fermenter for that extra 3 weeks, sped up certain reactions, certain staling reactions, certain off flavor reactions during that time that did cause that difference. Yeah.
We can't say with certainty that didn't cause the noticeable difference. I am given all of the fermentation temperature experiments that we've done and the fact that 45F is still quite cool. I'm not convinced that's what it was. I'm also not totally sure. I didn't taste these beers. I don't know what they tasted like. You can't be 100% certain that the difference was that big or that it wasn't caused by this. But at the same time, I tend to think with how you isolated the variable that it was most likely caused by the extended time in primary. Again, not a good or a bad thing, but that seems more likely to me than the storage temperature once that beer was done fermenting. Who knows though? I think it's a good point. So. All right, Fred Hirsch, he says, I expected this one to have some relevance since I've encountered this in some of my own beers that have sat in the fermenter over a month. In all those cases, I get significant amounts of acetaldehyde in my beer. I learned that this is caused by natural alcohol oxidation reactions, not the typical green beer problems we often encounter.
Interesting. So I don't think either of these beers had significant acetaldehyde. I mean, it's definitely possible that I don't pick up on that as well as other people. But it's not like I was opening up the fermentation vessel, to pull samples from the top and exposing these alcohols to oxygen, that would cause that. I mean, again, kind of going back to the point I made earlier about, kind of like those micro vacuums and maybe the vessel not being perfectly sealed. But I think those SS brew buckets do a pretty good job of not letting in oxygen. But that's definitely possible, and that's a very good point.
It's interesting to me that he says it makes it sound like it's every beer that he's let age for that long that he gets this acetaldehyde issue. When I think of acetaldehyde, I usually think of getting the beer off the yeast cake too soon. That's what I was taught leads to that off flavor, and it's not a good one. I like Malcolm's description of acetaldehyde as being like fresh cut pumpkin. I don't get the green apple thing necessarily, but yeah, it seems to me like it would get that particular compound would reduce by being in contact with the yeast cake over time and not increase. So it's interesting. I've not experienced that in the slightest, but again, like you, Jake, perhaps I'm just not terribly sensitive to that one. Interesting feedback though, Fred. So thanks for that. Reddit user Evil Bonsai says, I'm a bit lazy, and since I started with small 2-gallon batches, pulling any for SG check was anathema. Now, pretty much all of my beers stay in the fermenter for 3 weeks with several days to cold crash. This is interesting because that 3 weeks, again, is I don't even know if you remember this, Jake, but back in the olden days, I guess, 20 years ago or so, it was a 1-2-3 rule, right? It was 1 week in primary, 2 weeks in secondary, and then 3 in your package. But that 3 weeks became kind of this thing that, like, you just did it. It was 3 weeks of fermentation before you package it. And so people condensed that, right? They added the secondary to the primary. So what it sounds like what this Evil Bonsai is saying is that he or she is, even for 2-gallon batches, to preserve that volume of beer, just leaving the beer alone in the fermenter for 3 weeks and then packaging without even checking the FG. So
yeah, I mean, that sounds, I think, like a very reasonable approach to brewing beer.
It does. I don't know why anybody would wait 3 weeks though. I
know.
You know what I mean? I mean,
wouldn't.
the combining it like that, those two steps, 3 weeks is just so long. I promise you, unless you're using really crappy yeast, your beer's done fermenting for the most part, a matter of 7 to 10 days,
Yeah. No, I totally agree, but I don't know. I think sometimes, people just have things that come up and just don't necessarily have the time during the week to brew. And if that's what keeps you brewing is the ability to do it once every 3 weeks. I mean, I definitely don't see an issue with that, but yeah. I wouldn't leave it that long unless, just stuff happened.
Yeah. Well, and you know what? People develop their approach, and it's just what they do, and it works for them. And hey, kudos, man. Keep doing that. But I'm not sure it's necessary, but I like the style. So, all right. Reddit user Lil Marla says, so how long would be too long in a primary fermenter? We started an amber ale in October. This was back in 2018, and it's been sitting in our glass carboy since then. Is it salvageable at all? I believe this was about 5 or 6 months in the carboy for Lil Marla.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a long time in the carboy. Yeah, because I think we published this in March 2019. So, yeah, about 5 months. I mean, the only thing you can really do at that point is just, bottle it up or keg it up and try it out. I think more likely than not, it'll probably still be, very drinkable and probably taste like a good homebrew.
Yeah, there was another rule of thumb when it comes to how long to keep beer in primary on that trub, and what I remember hearing was don't go past 6 months. So of course the contrarian in me was like, well, I'm going to try this out. So I just made like a blonde ale or a pale ale one time. This was before I was doing the side by side brewing, and left it in the primary. I think it was for 7 months or so. Just kind of, it was stayed in the side of my fermentation chamber while I fermented other beers. And I don't recall there being any issues with it. I do think the 6 month rule of thumb makes sense though, because 6 month, give or take a month or two, I guess. But there's really, if you really are leaving it in there because you don't have time to package it, or maybe all your packaging stuff is full, then okay, I get leaving it there. But I don't know if you're getting any benefit by aging it in primary for that long, you know?
I would agree. And I think more likely than not, you're probably doing harm to it. I know one of my brewing buddies who, sometimes he'll get like a hankering to brew a couple, and then like all of a sudden it kind of goes away, and whatever is in the primary vessel kind of stays there. And then like every couple months when we go over and visit, prior to being in quarantine for a few months, every couple months when we go over and visit, he would open up the top, pull some samples for us. And I think that, like, just doing that act, like if you're actually just leaving it alone and not opening it up and poking around in there, might be fine. But if you're looking at it every few weeks and taking the lid off and pulling samples and stuff, then I think you might start to run into some issues, after a couple months of doing that.
Absolutely. And, I couldn't agree with you more on that. And again, to kind of just smooth out my point a little bit, my opinion has to do with what your intention is. If your intention is make the beer, don't have time, then fine. I think leaving it alone is not going to ruin it. Like you said, if you're not taking the lid off all the time or dipping your fingers in there or anything like that. If you think you're getting something out of it, I'm just not sure I agree with that. But who knows? I'm not leaving beer in a primary for 6 months. I know that. So, all right. Final comment comes from Reddit user Kraka293. As someone who routinely gets caught up with life and sometimes leaves batches and fermenters too long, I'm glad to see the results of this one. While there was a difference between the beer, there was no real consensus on which one was better. I'll chalk that up to a net tie.
I totally agree. I mean, that's basically kind of how I take the results of this one in terms of my own brewing. Kind of like what you've been saying and kind of what I've been saying throughout this entire podcast is that, really, we don't see the benefit of leaving something in there for a long time. But like anybody, stuff happens. Like for me last year, like having a new kid and, having to help out around the house with having two around and not really having time to dedicate to brewing like I did, previously or I do now. I did leave some of my beers in primary for longer than I probably ever have in the past or would like to, but stuff just happens. And I kegged up those beers and drank them, and I thought they tasted fine. And did I look back to the results of this one and say like, oh, that was significant? I was all nervous about the beers being in there for so long. Not really. I just kind of just kind of stuff happened and they got kegged late and they still tasted good.
Yeah, so it goes, right? I mean, there are definitely experiments that we've done where the results influence my approach or cause me to worry a little more, cause me to worry a little bit less. This one wasn't one of them. I mean, even though it was significant, I'm not convinced that the difference was a negative one. It was just different, and it seems so subtle that I just don't. Again, I've said it a million times. I just don't think leaving a beer around for 5 to 6 weeks in the primary is going to have too big of a negative impact. So, well, that brings us to the end of yet another episode. Jake, anything else on leaving beer in primary for an extended period of time?
No, not really. I think we pretty much covered it all. It's not something that I like to do. I want to get it in the keg and drink it as quick as I can. But, if something happens where it has to stay in there, I'm not too concerned about it.
Amen to that. You can read more about this experiment by clicking the link to the article on brewlosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the